Imagine this. Everything you were taught about the beginning of civilization rests on a fragile assumption that humanity rose once, that progress moved forward in a straight line, that before agriculture, cities and writing, there was only simplicity. But what if that story exists not because it is true, but because it is comforting? What if the real history of our species is older, darker, and far less stable than we have been led to believe? Because buried beneath the world we walk on is evidence that refuses to stay silent, evidence that suggests humanity did not rise once, but again and again, and that each time something erased what came before. Before we go any further, I'd like to know where you're listening from tonight. Are you winding down after a long day, keeping watch through the quiet hours, or drifting towards sleep somewhere far from where this story unfolds? Wherever you are, thank you for being here. Now let us begin. The first warning does not come from myth or legend. It comes from the ground itself. Across the world, monumental architecture appears suddenly in the historical record, not gradually, not experimentally, but fully formed. Stone structures with engineering precision that should require centuries of trial and error emerge without visible prototypes. Calendars tracking celestial cycles appear with accuracy that demands long-term astronomical observation. Megalithic sites align to stars that only matched their configuration thousands of years before the structures were supposedly built. And according to the accepted timeline, the people responsible should not have possessed the knowledge required to do any of this. That contradiction is the crack in the foundation. When historians encounter it, they often respond with caution. Terms like coincidence, symbolism, or lost techniques are introduced, but the contradictions do not disappear. They accumulate. Step closer to the edges of accepted history and the ground begins to fracture. In deserts, there are ruins with no culture willing to claim them. In mountain ranges, stone blocks are cut with tolerances that modern tools struggle to replicate. Beneath the oceans, geometric layouts appear where coastlines once existed, arranged with intention, not erosion, and under layers of earth older than recorded civilization, objects occasionally surface that should not exist at all. Not legends, not stories, but physical artifacts embedded in geological contexts that defy their assigned place in time. These are known as out-of-place artifacts, OOPArts. Most are dismissed quickly, some are quietly archived, a few vanish entirely. Coal seams dated to hundreds of millions of years old have yielded metallic objects with machined surfaces. Limestone formations from the Cretaceous period have contained iron tools sealed within them. Volcanic layers far older than modern humanity have trapped objects resembling components that require deliberate manufacture. In many cases, contamination is proposed, and sometimes that explanation is valid. But when these discoveries recur across continents, time periods, and independent geological contexts, coincidence becomes an increasingly fragile defence. Geology does not lie easily. Coal forms from ancient plant matter under immense pressure over vast spans of time. Limestone solidifies from marine deposits laid down long before human existence. Volcanic ash layers can be dated with remarkable precision using radiometric methods. When objects are found sealed inside these layers, the question becomes unavoidable. How did they get there? The official answers often rely on error or fraud, and again, sometimes that is true. But fraud does not repeat with global consistency. Error does not follow a pattern, yet here a pattern emerges. The deeper the object lies, the older the surrounding material, the more resistant institutions become to further investigation. Artifacts are removed from public display. Papers are quietly withdrawn. Researchers find their funding reduced or redirected. And this leads to a question few are willing to ask aloud. Why would evidence of ancient technological capability be inconvenient? One answer is institutional inertia. The modern academic timeline is carefully constructed. Careers, reputations, and entire fields depend on its stability. Introducing civilizations far older than accepted history would force a painful re-examination of everything that follows. But another answer is more unsettling. If advanced civilizations existed before ours, and if they were erased, then our modern world is not unprecedented, it is vulnerable. Fire alone cannot erase a civilization completely. Floods alone cannot do it. Ice alone cannot do it. But a sequence can. Rapid climate shift, sudden sea level rise, atmospheric disruption, geological instability, a reset. Earth's geological record reveals that such resets have occurred repeatedly. Ice cores show abrupt temperature drops lasting decades. Sediment layers record sudden flooding events that drown coastlines in months, not millennia. Extinction markers reveal moments when entire ecosystems collapsed nearly simultaneously. And after each disruption, life reorganized. So did humanity. Imagine history not as a line, but as a wave. Civilizations rise during periods of stability. They expand. They specialize. They forget fragility. Then the stability breaks. The collapse is violent enough that memory itself shatters. Survivors scatter into mountains, forests, islands, caves. They carry fragments of knowledge they no longer fully understand. When conditions stabilize again, their descendants rebuild. They believe they are the beginning. They are not. They are the aftermath. This model explains something that has long troubled archaeologists. Why do complex skills appear suddenly in the record? Why does agriculture emerge almost simultaneously in distant regions? Why does monumental stonework appear without visible developmental stages? Why do early civilizations display astronomical knowledge that should require thousands of years of observation? Perhaps they are not inventing. Perhaps they are remembering. This reframes ancient myth entirely. Flood stories become trauma memories. Skyfire becomes impact debris or atmospheric ignition. Gods become teachers, not because they were supernatural, but because they carried inherited knowledge from a lost age. These stories persist because they were never meant to be literal histories. They were warnings. If this interpretation is even partially correct, then the implications are staggering. It would mean we are not humanity's first attempt at complexity. We are the seventh, and beneath our cities, our oceans and our deserts lie the ruins of 6 worlds that rose, flourished and vanished. This is not a claim. It is a hypothesis built from anomalies, geological evidence, and patterns that refuse to align with the official narrative. The question is not whether such civilizations could exist. The question is why the evidence remains fragmented. Why does each discovery appear isolated? Why are connections discouraged? Why does the story always stop just short of coherence? Because coherence changes everything. If 6 civilizations fell before ours, then progress is not guaranteed. Technology is not salvation, and collapse is not failure, it is recurrence. And that raises the most difficult question of all. If previous civilizations were erased, what erased them? And more importantly, what cycle are we approaching now? Those answers do not arrive quickly. They wait beneath oceans, inside mountains, encoded in myths, preserved in stone. And in the next segment we will begin to trace those erased worlds, not through speculation, but through the physical remains that survived the resets, the fragments that were never meant to be found. If humanity truly rose only once, then the ground beneath us should tell a simple story. Layers of soil, gradual improvement of tools, clear transitions from primitive to complex, but that is not what the Earth reveals. Instead, the deeper we look, the more discontinuous the story becomes. Geologists read time in layers, not in dates. They examine sediment, mineral composition, fossil distribution, and erosion patterns. And again, those layers show abrupt breaks, moments when the world did not gently change, but restarted. Entire landscapes vanish between layers. River systems appear and disappear. Forests turn to tundra almost overnight. Coastlines retreat miles inland in what should have taken millennia. These are not subtle transitions, they are resets. And wherever these resets occur, something else disappears with them. Human presence, not all humans, but organised, settled, complex humanity. This is the first clue that civilizations may have existed long before the one we call the beginning. Let us start with the coastlines. During the last ice age, sea levels were more than 120 metres lower than today. This exposed vast continental shelves, entire landscapes now hidden beneath the oceans. These were not marginal lands. They were fertile plains, river deltas, and coastal zones ideal for settlement. In other words, they were prime real estate for early civilization. When the ice sheets melted rapidly, those lands did not flood slowly. Geological evidence shows sudden pulses of meltwater, events where sea levels rose metres within a human lifetime. Anything built there would be erased, and erased cleanly. No gradual abandonment, no long decay, just disappearance. This alone could explain why the earliest coastal civilizations are missing from the historical record, but it does not explain what sonar mapping has revealed in recent decades. Across multiple ocean basins, researchers have identified submerged structures that display unmistakable signs of intentional design. Rectangular foundations, terraced platforms, linear causeways, stone blocks arranged in repeating geometric patterns. Nature does not build grids. Off the coast of Japan, near Yonaguni, massive stepped formations descend into the sea. At first glance, they appear geological, but closer examination reveals right angles, straight edges, and symmetrical terraces stacked like a forgotten ziggurat. In the Indian Ocean, near the ancient coast of Gujarat, sonar scans revealed what appears to be a submerged city. Walls, streets, and foundations laid out with urban planning principles that match descriptions found in ancient Sanskrit texts. These descriptions were dismissed as legend until the city was found exactly where the stories said it would be. Across the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, underwater surveys have revealed ancient river channels, stone alignments, and elevated plateaus that suggest long-term human habitation before rising seas consumed the region. These discoveries do not fit comfortably within the accepted timeline, which is why they are rarely discussed together. Each is treated as an anomaly. Each is isolated. Each is explained away individually. But patterns are not meant to be viewed in isolation. When you place these sites on a map, something else emerges. They cluster in regions that would have been stable, resource-rich, and strategically positioned during earlier climate periods, regions that vanished during rapid environmental shifts, which suggests that if civilizations existed before ours, they did not disappear because they failed. They disappeared because the world changed faster than they could adapt, and this has happened more than once. Climate science reveals multiple abrupt transitions across the last several 100,000 years. Periods where Earth's systems flipped rapidly, temperature, precipitation, ocean currents, and atmospheric composition shifting in a geological instant. Each of these periods would have been catastrophic for any civilization dependent on stable conditions. The Younger Dryas is the most well-known example. Roughly 12,900 years ago, global temperatures plunged back into near glacial conditions for over 1,000 years. The transition was sudden, Ice cores show temperature drops occurring within decades, possibly faster. Sea levels stalled, ecosystems collapsed, megafauna vanished, and human populations were pushed to the brink. When the Younger Dryas ended just as abruptly, the climate stabilised, and almost immediately civilization reappeared. Agriculture spread, permanent settlements emerged, monumental construction began. This sequence is deeply suspicious, because it implies that complexity returned not after a long recovery, but almost immediately after stabilisation, which suggests continuity, not invention. Now consider that the Younger Dryas was not unique. Ice core records show multiple abrupt climate oscillations before it, some lasting centuries, some lasting millennia. Each would have devastated existing societies. Each would have reset the surface of the planet, which raises an unavoidable possibility. What if the civilization we call the first is actually the seventh? What if 6 others rose during earlier periods of stability, only to be erased by rapid environmental collapse? This idea gains strength when we examine inland evidence. In the Sahara, satellite imaging has revealed ancient river systems and buried structures beneath the sand. Regions now inhospitable were once green, fertile and densely populated. Rock art depicts cattle herding, boats, and organised community life. Yet when the climate shifted and the region dried, everything vanished, not slowly, abruptly. In South America, LiDAR scans through the Amazon canopy have uncovered massive earthworks, networks of roads, canals and settlements covering thousands of square kilometres. These were not small tribal villages, they were coordinated societies capable of large-scale environmental engineering, and yet they disappeared. The rainforest reclaimed everything. No stone monuments remained above ground, no written records survived, only geometry beneath the trees. In northern regions, Beringia once connected Asia and the Americas, a vast landmass supporting megafauna and human populations. When sea levels rose, it vanished beneath the Bering Strait. Any civilization there would be lost entirely. No ruins, no cities, just genetic echoes among indigenous populations. And then there are the gaps, long periods where tool complexity stagnates or even regresses before suddenly leaping forward again. This is not how linear progress behaves, it is how recovery behaves. Civilizations rebuilding from fragments do not improve gradually. They jump when memory returns. This explains why early monumental sites often appear more sophisticated than later constructions. The oldest stonework is frequently the most precise. Later cultures reuse foundations they did not build. They imitate techniques they do not understand. They degrade what they inherited. This pattern appears in Egypt, Peru, Mesopotamia, and across the Mediterranean, which suggests inheritance from something older, something lost. At this point, the question shifts. It is no longer whether earlier civilizations could have existed. It is whether the evidence makes sense without them. And increasingly, it does not. But evidence alone does not explain behaviour, which brings us to the most troubling pattern of all, the reaction. Why are these discoveries not central to historical discourse? Why are they treated as fringe, even when the data is real? Why does each piece of evidence vanish into obscurity instead of forming a larger picture? Some argue it is caution, some argue it is academic conservatism, some argue it is political. But there is another explanation, one that aligns with human behaviour across history. Knowledge that destabilises identity is often resisted. If humanity is not the first advanced civilization, if progress is cyclical, if collapse is inevitable, then modern civilization loses its sense of uniqueness. And uniqueness is comforting. It suggests safety. It suggests control. But cycles suggest something else entirely. They suggest recurrence, and recurrence implies responsibility. If 6 civilizations fell before us, then the most important question is not how they lived. It is why they fell, and whether we are repeating the same mistakes. That investigation cannot begin with myth. It must begin with forces. Forces capable of erasing civilizations completely. Forces older than humanity. In the next segment, we will examine those forces, not as speculation, but as measurable, repeating phenomena written into Earth's own rhythms, the mechanisms of collapse, and the signs that they may be returning. If 6 civilizations truly vanished before ours, then the explanation cannot rest on chance. Entire worlds do not disappear accidentally. They are erased by forces that operate on scales far larger than any society, forces woven into the deep mechanics of the planet itself. To understand what may have ended earlier civilizations, we must step away from human history and look instead at Earth as a system, restless, cyclical, and indifferent. Because Earth does not move gently through time, it pulses. Geologists have long known that the planet experiences periodic instability. These are not slow evolutionary shifts, but abrupt transitions that reshape climates, coastlines, and ecosystems within decades or less. The most important of these forces is climate oscillation. Ice core records extracted from Greenland and Antarctica show temperature changes occurring so rapidly that entire ecosystems would have collapsed within a human lifetime. In some cases, temperatures shifted by several degrees in less than 50 years. For a civilization dependent on agriculture, stable seasons, and predictable water sources, such a shift would be catastrophic. Crops would fail, rivers would change course, food chains would collapse. But climate alone does not explain total erasure. Civilizations can migrate, they can adapt, they can rebuild, unless climate change is paired with something else. And historically, it often is. One of the most destructive combinations in Earth's past is rapid warming, followed by sudden flooding. As ice sheets melt, sea levels rise, but not evenly. Geological evidence shows sudden meltwater pulses, where massive volumes of glacial water entered the oceans over short periods of time. The most dramatic of these events may have occurred around 14,600 years ago, during what scientists call meltwater pulse 1A. Sea levels rose by as much as 20 metres in a few centuries, and possibly faster. Imagine coastal civilizations watching the shoreline advance year after year, swallowing harbours, homes, and farmland. Now imagine that rise accelerating. No evacuation plan, no warning system, no way to preserve cities built at sea level. Entire cultures would vanish beneath the waves, and those waves would not stop at the coast. Floodwaters would push inland, salinising soil, contaminating freshwater, and rendering once fertile land unusable. But flooding still leaves survivors. To erase a civilization's memory, as well as its infrastructure, requires something more. That something more often arrives from the sky. Volcanic eruptions have shaped human history repeatedly. The eruption of Mount Toba, roughly 74,000 years ago, may have triggered a volcanic winter that lasted years. Ash clouds blocked sunlight. Temperatures dropped. Vegetation collapsed. Genetic evidence suggests that the global human population may have fallen to just a few thousand individuals during this period. If a civilization existed before such an event, it would have been annihilated. And Toba is not unique. Geological records reveal repeated episodes of massive volcanic activity across Earth's history. Entire regions were blanketed in ash. Air became toxic. Rain turned acidic. Civilizations cannot function when the sky itself becomes hostile. Yet there is another force, rarer but even more devastating: Cosmic impacts. Asteroid and comet strikes have reshaped Earth multiple times. The Chicxulub impact 66 million years ago ended the age of dinosaurs. Smaller impacts have caused regional devastation throughout human prehistory. Evidence for a possible impact or airburst around the beginning of the Younger Dryas is still debated, but markers such as elevated platinum levels, microspherules, and shocked quartz have been found across multiple continents. If such an event occurred, the effects would have been immediate and global. Firestorms, shockwaves, atmospheric debris blocking sunlight. This would explain many ancient descriptions of skyfire, burning rain, and years without summer. It would also explain why multiple disasters often appear together in the record. Impact triggers climate disruption. Climate disruption melts ice. Melting ice floods continents. Volcanic activity intensifies under shifting pressure. A cascade. A reset. This is not speculation. Earth's systems are interconnected. Disturb one and others respond. Now consider the timeline. These events do not occur randomly. They cluster. Earth's orbit changes over time. Its axial tilt varies. Its magnetic field drifts and weakens periodically. These factors influence climate, radiation exposure, and geological stress. Milankovitch cycles, regular variations in Earth's orbit, affect the distribution of sunlight and drive long-term climate patterns. Superimposed on these are irregular but powerful events like impacts and eruptions. When multiple cycles align, instability peaks. If civilizations rose during stable windows and collapsed when cycles converged, then history becomes rhythmic rather than linear. Rise, peak, reset. And crucially, reset does not mean extinction. It means erasure of complexity. Small groups survive. Knowledge fragments persist. Memory becomes myth. This explains why ancient stories emphasize survival rather than conquest. They remember escape, not triumph. Boats, mountains, chosen remnants. These are not metaphors of morality. They are survival strategies encoded in a narrative. The more we examine the physical evidence, the clearer this pattern becomes. Civilizations do not disappear evenly. They are cut off abruptly. Which brings us to a deeply uncomfortable realization. If the same forces that ended previous civilizations are cyclical, then our civilization is not immune. We often assume modern technology grants protection. It does not. Satellites fail in solar storms. Power grids collapse under geomagnetic disturbances. Global supply chains fracture under climate stress. The complexity that defines modern civilization is also its greatest vulnerability. Earlier civilizations may have been less technologically advanced, but they were no less exposed, and perhaps they were erased not because they were weak, but because they were complex. Complex systems fail catastrophically. This is a principle known across disciplines, from engineering to ecology. When stability breaks, simple systems bend. Complex systems shatter. This reframes ancient collapse not as failure, but as inevitability. Civilizations rise by mastering complexity. They fall when complexity outruns resilience. And Earth provides the stress test. This perspective does not diminish human achievement. It contextualizes it. It suggests that every civilization, including ours, is temporary, and that survival across cycles depends not on dominance, but adaptability. The question then becomes, did earlier civilizations recognize this? Did they anticipate collapse? Did they try to warn those who would come after? If so, where would such warnings be preserved? Not in cities doomed to flood, not in technologies dependent on power, not in materials vulnerable to erosion. They would be preserved in stories, in monuments aligned to the sky, in symbols tied to cycles rather than dates, and perhaps even in the human body itself, In the next segment, we will examine how memory may persist beyond culture, how biology, myth, and architecture converge to preserve warnings across time, not as prophecy, but as pattern. When civilizations fall, buildings crumble first, stone fractures, metal corrodes, cities vanish beneath water, ash, or soil. But memory behaves differently. It does not rely on walls or roads. It does not require continuity of institutions. It survives in places collapse cannot easily reach. Inside people. This is the most overlooked element in the study of lost civilizations. Not the ruins themselves, but the mechanisms by which fragments of knowledge persist long after the structures that produce them are gone. Because if 6 civilizations truly rose before ours, and if each ended abruptly, then some form of continuity must have bridged the silence between them. Otherwise, every cycle would begin from nothing, and that is not what the evidence suggests. Across the archaeological record, complexity reappears too quickly. Agriculture returns with sophisticated crop management. Astronomy emerges with precise calendrical systems. Architecture resumes with advanced geometry and alignment. These are not inventions made from scratch. They are recoveries. This raises an uncomfortable question. What carries knowledge through collapse? The answer is not writing. Writing is fragile. It burns. It erodes. It requires literacy, infrastructure, and continuity. The answer is not technology. Technology requires supply chains, energy, and specialization. The most resilient carrier of knowledge is narrative, story, oral tradition. For much of human history, oral cultures were dismissed as unreliable. Stories changed over time. Details blurred. Accuracy decayed. But modern anthropology has overturned this assumption. Oral traditions are not meant to preserve details. They preserve structure. They encode relationships. They highlight patterns. They prioritize what matters most. This is why flood myths persist globally. Not because every culture invented them independently, but because flooding was repeatedly catastrophic enough to require preservation in memory. And not just flooding. Stories of skyfire, of long winters, of burning rain, of oceans swallowing land. These narratives appear among cultures separated by oceans, languages, and thousands of years. The consistency is not perfect, but the core is. Something happened. It came suddenly. It destroyed nearly everything. A few survived, they rebuilt. This is not mythology as fantasy. It is mythology as compression. When memory must survive collapse, it sheds complexity, technical. Explanations vanish. Emotional truths remain. And emotional truths are powerful. They shape behaviour long after the original context is forgotten. This explains why ancient monuments are often symbolic rather than practical. They are not merely buildings. They are mnemonic devices. Stone calendars encode cycles. Alignments track celestial repetition. Massive scale ensures durability. If you wanted to warn future civilizations of repeating catastrophes, you would not leave a manual. You would leave markers that say, the sky matters. The cycles return. Do not assume permanence. This perspective reframes ancient architecture. The pyramids are not tombs alone. Stone circles are not ritual curiosities. Megalithic sites are not random expressions of belief. They are memory anchors. They survive erosion. They outlast cultures. They demand attention, which may explain why the oldest structures are often the most precisely aligned. Precision matters when you are encoding cycles. If a monument tracks a solstice, precession, or stellar alignment, it is not about worship, it is about timing. This is why many ancient sites align not with current skies, but with skies as they existed thousands of years earlier. They are calibrated to the past, or perhaps to the future. But memory is not stored only in stone. Recent advances in genetics suggest another layer of continuity. Human DNA is not just a biological blueprint, it is a historical archive. Population bottlenecks, periods when humanity was nearly wiped out, leave signatures in the genome. These bottlenecks align suspiciously well with known periods of environmental catastrophe. Around 74,000 years ago, during the Toba eruption, genetic diversity dropped sharply. Around 12,900 years ago, during the Younger Dryas, population stress markers appear again. Survivors passed on not only genes, but traits suited to instability, heightened stress response, endurance under scarcity, enhanced. Spatial awareness. These traits do not make a civilization, but they help a remnant survive long enough to rebuild one. Some researchers have identified rare genetic clusters that appear in populations linked geographically to ancient coastlines, highland refuges, or isolated regions. These clusters often involve metabolic efficiency, oxygen processing, and cognitive spatial mapping. Nothing supernatural, just adaptation. But adaptation implies selection pressure, which implies catastrophe. What is remarkable is not that such traits exist, it is that they persist, even after thousands of years of relative stability, as though the genome remembers conditions long past. This idea is uncomfortable, because it suggests that collapse is not an anomaly. It is a recurring feature of the human story, and that some part of us knows this. Which brings us to another fragile carrier of memory, ritual. Ritual survives collapse because it requires no explanation. It is practiced because it is practiced. When societies rebuild, rituals often return before institutions. Burial customs, seasonal ceremonies, celestial observations. These rituals preserve timing and behaviour. They tell people when to plant, when to move, when to prepare. They also encode caution. Many ancient rituals involve appeasing forces beyond human control, not because those forces are gods, but because they are unpredictable. Weather, earthquakes, the sky. Ritual teaches humility. It reinforces the idea that humans are not in charge, which may be the most important lesson passed down from lost civilizations. Because every civilization that collapses does so believing itself stable. The more advanced it becomes, the more fragile it grows. This is not pessimism, it is systems theory. Complexity increases efficiency, but reduces resilience. Ancient civilizations may not have articulated this mathematically, but they understood it intuitively, which is why their warnings are not precise. Instructions, but philosophical frameworks. They teach attentiveness rather than control. They tell us to watch the sky, to respect cycles, to remember impermanence. This memory survives because it is adaptive, and adaptation is the true inheritance passed between civilizations. Not technology, not power, not dominance, adaptation. If earlier civilizations rose and fell, their greatest gift to us may not be what they built, but what they learned, and that lesson may be encoded everywhere, in stories that refuse to disappear, in monuments that resist erosion, in genes that respond to instability, in rituals that outlast kingdoms, all pointing toward the same realization. Civilization is not a destination, it is a phase Earth has allowed repeatedly and ended repeatedly. The difference now is awareness. We are the first civilization capable of seeing the full pattern, of reading ice cores, of scanning oceans, of sequencing genomes. We can see the cycles, which raises a final, unsettling question. If memory survived collapse 6 times before, what will survive this time? Because survival is not guaranteed. But memory is always looking for a place to land. In the next segment, we will examine whether modern humanity is preserving the right memories or repeating the same mistakes that erased the worlds before us. Every civilization believes it is different, not simply more advanced, but fundamentally separate from everything that came before it. This belief is not arrogance alone, it is psychological necessity. To build cities, to plan generations ahead, to invest meaning in institutions, a society must assume continuity. It must believe that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to justify effort. Without that belief, nothing large is built. And yet, when viewed across deep time, permanence is the rarest illusion of all. The archaeological record does not show gradual decay. It shows abrupt endings. Civilizations do not gently fade into obscurity. They stop. Entire networks vanish. Trade routes collapse simultaneously. Languages disappear without descendants. Technologies cease to exist. This pattern repeats too consistently to be coincidence. The fall of the Akkadian Empire, for example, coincides with a sudden and prolonged drought recorded in sediment cores across Mesopotamia. Crops failed, cities emptied, political power disintegrated not over centuries, but within a few generations. The Maya collapse followed a similar trajectory. Multiple city-states declined almost simultaneously, driven by climate instability, resource stress, and internal fragmentation. Even the Roman Empire, often portrayed as a slow decline, experienced sharp regional collapses tied to climatic cooling, pandemics, and supply chain failure. These are not ancient mysteries. They are warnings written clearly in history. But here is what makes earlier civilizations different. Their collapses appear to have been more complete. Modern. Societies fall, but remnants remain. Texts survive. Technologies persist. Knowledge transfers. In earlier cycles, something erased not only cities, but continuity itself. This suggests that the scale of disruption was far greater. Sea levels did not rise by meters, but by tens or hundreds of meters. Temperatures did not fluctuate slightly, but plunged or spiked catastrophically. The sky itself may have changed. Evidence for these shifts exists. Meltwater pulse, 1A, raised sea levels by roughly 20 meters in less than 500 years. Entire coastlines vanished. Ice core records show abrupt cooling events, where temperatures dropped several degrees in a matter of decades. Volcanic super-eruptions like Toba likely reduced global sunlight for years. Impact events remain debated, but evidence of cosmic debris layers persists. Each of these could reset civilization. Combined, they would erase it, which brings us to the illusion of permanence in our own age. Modern civilization feels stable because it is global. Supply chains span continents. Communication is instant. Redundancy appears built in. But global systems are also tightly coupled. When one fails, others follow. This is not speculation. It is observable behaviour. A disruption in energy supply affects food. Food affects migration. Migration affects political stability. Political instability affects infrastructure. Collapse cascades. Earlier civilizations were localized. Their collapses were contained. Ours is not. Which makes us uniquely vulnerable. And yet, our confidence remains high. We assume technology will save us. That innovation will outpace risk. That adaptation will be smooth. But history suggests otherwise. Technological sophistication does not prevent collapse. It often accelerates it, because advanced systems rely on precise conditions. When those conditions shift, failure is catastrophic. This may explain why earlier civilizations that reached high levels of organization were erased more completely. Their complexity made them brittle, which raises an unsettling possibility. Perhaps the reason evidence of earlier advanced civilizations is scarce is not because they never existed, but because their sophistication ensured their erasure. Stone survives when steel rusts. Simple tools persist when complex machines fail. Oral memory endures when digital archives vanish. If a civilization builds entirely on fragile systems, it leaves little behind. This reframes the archaeological silence. Absence of evidence may be evidence of absence only when preservation conditions are equal. They were not, which leads to a deeper question. What if earlier civilizations understood this? What if they knew permanence was an illusion? And what if their greatest effort was not to preserve their structures, but to preserve warnings? Consider again the focus on cycles, precession of the equinoxes, solar activity, geomagnetic shifts, orbital variations. These are not obvious concerns for early farmers, yet they dominate ancient cosmology. Why? Because cycles predict instability. They tell you when the ground beneath you may change. A civilization that understands cycles may not survive collapse, but it may help the next one recognize it. This may explain why ancient knowledge is often symbolic rather than explicit. Symbols survive reinterpretation. Technical manuals do not, which brings us back to suppression. If modern institutions suppress evidence of earlier cycles, they are repeating the behaviour of past elites who assumed stability could be maintained through control. History suggests this never works. Control fails when the system itself shifts. The only strategy that has ever allowed continuity is adaptation, and adaptation begins with awareness, which is why the illusion of permanence is the most dangerous belief any civilization can hold. It prevents preparation. It discourages humility. It resists revision. It blinds societies to warning signs. And those signs are not subtle. Climate instability, resource depletion, ecological stress, magnetic field drift, increased seismic and volcanic activity. These do not guarantee collapse, but they mirror conditions present before earlier endings, which makes our moment unique. We are not ignorant, we have data, we have models, we have records of past failures. What we lack is willingness to integrate them into our identity. We still see collapse as something that happens to others, to ancient people, to distant empires, to hypothetical futures, not to us. And yet, every civilization that fell believed the same. This realization reframes the question of whether we are the seventh civilization. The number matters less than the pattern. Rise, stabilize, assume permanence, ignore warnings, collapse. The cycle does not require malice, only neglect, which leads to the most important question of all. If earlier civilizations left warnings encoded in stone, story, and instinct, are we listening? Or are we too convinced of our uniqueness to hear them? In the next segment, we will examine how modern society responds to existential warning signs, and whether our reactions mirror the denial patterns that preceded earlier collapses. Every collapse begins long before the first building falls. It begins in the language, not in what is said, but in what is avoided. Civilizations rarely ignore danger because they cannot see it. They ignore danger because acknowledging it threatens the stories they tell themselves. This pattern is visible again and again in the historical record. Warnings emerge, anomalies accumulate, contradictions surface, and yet institutions respond not with investigation, but with normalization. The Roman Senate did not deny famine. They reframed it as temporary. The Maya priesthood did not deny drought. They intensified rituals. The rulers of Akkad did not deny environmental stress. They blamed neighbouring peoples. In every case, the problem was not lack of information, it was the refusal to reimagine the future, because doing so would require admitting that the present was fragile. We see the same behavioural structure today. Climate models grow more precise. Ecosystems destabilise. Geological indicators shift. Yet the dominant response is delay, adjustment, not transformation, mitigation, not redesign. Why? Because transformation implies that the existing order is unsustainable, and unsustainability threatens legitimacy. This is not conspiracy, it is structural behaviour. Large systems protect themselves by maintaining continuity narratives. Universities defend paradigms, governments defend stability, corporations defend growth. None are inherently malicious, but all are incentivized to minimize disruption, which creates a paradox. The institutions best equipped to detect large-scale risk are also the least able to respond decisively to it. This was true in the past. It appears to be true now. Consider how modern societies frame existential risk. Climate change is discussed in percentages and projections. Mass extinction becomes a statistic. Sea level rise is reduced to centimetres per year. These framings are accurate, but they are also distancing. They abstract reality into manageable units. Earlier, civilizations used myth for the same purpose. Flood stories, sky-fire legends, gods of destruction. These narratives soften trauma by placing it outside human agency. Modern narratives do something similar. They place collapse in the future, always later, always gradual, always manageable. But geological records tell a different story. Change is often non-linear. Tipping points exist. Ice sheets collapse suddenly. Ocean currents shift abruptly. Ecosystems flip states. The Younger Dryas did not unfold slowly. It arrived within decades. The end of the last glacial period was punctuated by sharp reversals. Stability is not the default state of Earth. It is a temporary condition, which raises an uncomfortable comparison. Earlier civilizations lacked our data, but they encoded warning patterns symbolically. We possess vast data, but struggle to translate it into action. In both cases, denial emerges, not because people are ignorant, but because acknowledging vulnerability threatens identity. Identity is the invisible structure beneath civilization. It defines who belongs, what matters, what endures. When that identity is challenged, defense mechanisms activate, discrediting anomalies, delaying response, reframing urgency as hysteria. This is why evidence of earlier civilizations is often dismissed not with counter-evidence, but with ridicule. The idea itself is labelled fringe, not because it is conclusively disproven, but because it destabilises assumptions. If civilization has risen and fallen multiple times, then progress is not guaranteed. And if progress is not guaranteed, then modernity is not destiny. That idea is deeply unsettling. It removes the comfort of linear ascent. It introduces responsibility, which may explain why societies prefer simpler narratives, a single origin, a single rise, a single trajectory. Complex cycles are harder to manage, yet complexity is closer to reality. The Earth system is complex. Human systems are complex, and complexity amplifies both resilience and fragility. Earlier civilizations may have collapsed not because they failed, but because they reached the limits of their environment. We may be approaching similar limits, but unlike them, we have historical precedent. We can recognize denial as a pattern, which raises a critical question. Is denial inevitable, or can awareness interrupt the cycle? There is evidence that some societies adapted successfully, not by preserving power structures, but by changing scale. Indigenous cultures that survived major climate shifts often did so by decentralizing, reducing population density, diversifying food sources, embedding ecological awareness into culture. These strategies do not prevent collapse, they soften it. They allow continuity of knowledge, even if cities fall. This suggests that the goal may not be to prevent the cycle, but to survive it intact, which reframes the role of knowledge. Perhaps earlier civilizations failed not because they lacked technology, but because they centralized it. When the centre fell, everything fell. Knowledge concentrated in institutions disappears when institutions collapse. Knowledge distributed through culture endures. Myths survive where manuals do not. This may explain why ancient warnings are symbolic. They were designed to persist through chaos, which brings us back to our own time. Our knowledge is highly centralized, stored digitally, maintained by energy-intensive systems, accessible only through infrastructure. If those systems fail, vast portions of our collective memory vanish. This vulnerability mirrors that of earlier advanced civilizations. We may be repeating the same mistake with more sophistication, which leads to a quiet but profound realization. Perhaps the measure of a civilization's success is not how high it rises, but how much it can carry through collapse. If we are the seventh civilization, then the eighth will inherit whatever we preserve, not our monuments, not our machines, but our understanding. The question becomes, what are we choosing to remember, and what are we allowing to disappear? In the next segment, we will explore whether modern humanity shows signs of unconscious preparation, behaviours that suggest we may already be responding to cyclical pressure without fully acknowledging it. Long before a civilization admits it is in danger, it begins to change its behaviour. Not openly, not deliberately, quietly. Anthropologists call this anticipatory adaptation. Psychologists call it preconscious response. History simply records it as instinct. When environmental or systemic pressure builds, societies begin adjusting in ways they do not fully understand. These changes are rarely framed as preparation. Instead, they appear as trends, innovations, cultural shifts, or technological preferences. But when viewed across time, they form a recognizable pattern. Earlier civilizations did the same. As stability weakened, they turned toward decentralization. As trust in institutions declined, they preserved knowledge in stories. As landscapes changed, they altered settlement patterns. The behaviour preceded the collapse. The awareness came later, if at all. We may be seeing similar signals now. Consider the growing emphasis on resilience rather than efficiency. For much of the industrial era, systems were optimized for speed, scale, and output. Redundancy was considered wasteful. Local production gave way to global supply chains. Yet in recent decades, that philosophy has begun to reverse. Local food systems are re-emerging. Decentralized energy grids gain attention. Distributed networks replace centralized hubs. These shifts are often framed as economic or environmental choices, but they also reflect an instinctive response to fragility. Highly optimized systems break catastrophically. Redundant systems bend. Earlier civilizations that collapsed appear to have lacked sufficient redundancy. Cities depended on single water sources. Agriculture relied on narrow climate windows. Power was centralized. When disruption came, there was no margin for error. Modern society, without fully acknowledging risk, seems to be correcting this. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but enough to notice. Another signal appears in how humanity preserves knowledge. For centuries, information was stored physically. Books, tablets, monuments. In the digital age, that shifted dramatically. Knowledge became ephemeral, dependent on electricity, dependent on networks. Yet recently, there has been a resurgence of analogue preservation, printed archives, physical backups, seed vaults carved into mountains. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault is often described as insurance against crop loss. But its deeper significance is cultural. It reflects an understanding, whether conscious or not, that systems fail. That continuity cannot be assumed. Earlier civilizations also built repositories. The Library of Alexandria may be the most famous, but it was not unique. Temples, monasteries, oral traditions all served as memory vaults. When cities fell, these preserved fragments endured. We appear to be doing something similar. Without saying why, there is also a growing fascination with deep time. Public interest in ancient civilizations, lost worlds, and cyclical history has increased noticeably. This is not nostalgia, it is pattern recognition. When people sense instability, they look backward for precedent. Earlier civilizations did this too. They revered ancestors. They mythologized previous ages. They believed knowledge had been lost. This belief was not pessimistic, it was instructive. It reminded them that the present was not permanent, which may explain why modern interest in ancient anomalies is often dismissed. It threatens the illusion of novelty. If humanity has been here before, then progress is not linear. And if progress is not linear, then regression is possible. This idea destabilizes identity, so it is resisted. Yet resistance does not stop adaptation. It merely drives it underground. Consider the rise of survival culture, preparedness movements, off-grid living. Skills once considered obsolete regain value. These behaviours are often caricatured as fringe, but historically, similar shifts preceded major transitions. Before the fall of Rome, rural self-sufficiency increased. Before the Maya collapse, communities diversified food sources. These were not political movements, they were adaptive responses. Modern society exhibits similar tendencies, not because collapse is inevitable, but because uncertainty is rising, and uncertainty triggers instinct. There is also a shift in values. Material accumulation loses appeal. Experiential knowledge gains importance. Connection to environment becomes central. This mirrors patterns seen in post-collapse cultures. When large systems fail, what remains are relationships, skills, and understanding. Civilizations that survive collapse do so culturally, not structurally, which raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps humanity is not sleepwalking toward collapse, but sleepwalking toward transition. Not all transitions are destructive, some are transformative, but transformation requires awareness, and awareness requires confronting uncomfortable truths, which brings us back to the idea of cycles. If civilizations rise and fall in response to environmental rhythms, then adaptation must also be rhythmic, not static. Earlier civilizations may have failed because they resisted change. They attempted to preserve structures rather than transform behaviours. We may be facing the same choice. Modern technology gives us unprecedented capacity to model risk, but modelling alone does not change outcomes. Action does, and action requires reframing identity. If we see ourselves as the pinnacle of history, adaptation feels like regression. If we see ourselves as one iteration in a long cycle, adaptation becomes continuity. This shift in perspective may be the most important adaptation of all, because it allows humility, and humility allows learning, which leads to a subtle but powerful insight. Perhaps the purpose of uncovering evidence of earlier civilizations is not to prove superiority or infer alien intervention. Perhaps it is to remind us that survival depends not on dominance, but on alignment. Alignment with environment, alignment with cycles, alignment with limits. Earlier civilizations may have reached technological heights that outpace their ecological awareness. We are at risk of doing the same. But unlike them, we have a record, fragmented, incomplete, contested, but present. The question is not whether we will face disruption. That is inevitable. The question is whether we will face it consciously, or repeat the pattern of denial. As awareness grows, adaptation may accelerate, not through centralized decree, but through distributed behavior, individuals adjusting, communities reorganizing, knowledge diversifying. This is how continuity survives collapse, not by preserving everything, but by preserving what matters. In the next segment, we will explore the final implication of cyclical civilization, what it means for the future, and whether awareness alone is enough to alter the trajectory. Every cycle ends the same way, until one does not. That sentence appears nowhere in ancient texts, yet it captures the quiet tension running beneath them all. Civilizations rarely recognize their own turning point. Collapse, when it comes, is usually explained afterward, never anticipated in real time. Those living within the final decades of an age tend to experience not apocalypse, but acceleration. More innovation, more building, more confidence, more urgency. The pattern is deceptive. The last centuries before disruption often feel like progress, not decline. This is where our era becomes difficult to interpret. By nearly every metric, humanity has reached unprecedented capability. Global communication is instantaneous. Scientific understanding spans from quantum mechanics to cosmology. Energy extraction, data processing, and material production operate on scales unimaginable to earlier cultures. And yet, despite this power, instability increases rather than decreases. Climate volatility intensifies, resource systems strain, social cohesion fractures. This contradiction is not new. It appears at the end of every known cycle. What changes is how civilizations respond. Earlier societies tended to double down on existing structures. They centralized authority. They codified belief. They fortified cities. They attempted to preserve what was already failing. The result was rigidity. When disruption came, rigid systems shattered. Flexibility survived. If humanity is to break the cycle, it must do something no previous civilization appears to have done. It must adapt before collapse, not after. That requires recognition. Recognition that the forces shaping history are not linear. Recognition that dominance does not equal durability. Recognition that progress without restraint accelerates fragility. These ideas challenge deeply held assumptions. Modern civilization defines success through growth, economic, technological, territorial. But growth is not neutral. It increases complexity, and complexity increases vulnerability. Earlier civilizations collapsed not because they lacked intelligence, but because their systems exceeded their environment's tolerance. The Roman Empire expanded faster than its logistical capacity. The Maya intensified agriculture beyond soil resilience. Mesopotamian irrigation salinized farmland beyond recovery. These were not failures of knowledge. They were failures of restraint. We may be facing a similar threshold, not because we are ignorant, but because our tools outpace our wisdom. The concept of planetary boundaries attempts to quantify this risk. Scientists identify limits beyond which systems destabilize. Climate, biodiversity, nitrogen cycles, freshwater availability. Crossing these thresholds does not cause immediate collapse. It initiates cascading effects. The same cascading effects appear in the archaeological record: gradual stress, localized failures, widening instability, sudden systemic breakdown. If cycles repeat, then early intervention matters. But intervention must be structural, not cosmetic. Switching technologies without changing behavior delays collapse. It does not prevent it. True adaptation requires redefining what civilization values. Earlier civilizations valued permanence, monuments, empires, dynasties. But permanence is an illusion. Everything built eventually returns to the earth. What persists is not structure, but knowledge, not power, but understanding, not dominance, but relationship. If we study the fragments left behind by earlier cycles, one thing becomes clear. The civilizations that vanished completely were those that centralized everything. Those that distributed knowledge survived indirectly. through myth, memory, genetics. This suggests a paradox. The more centralized a civilization becomes, the less resilient it is. The more distributed it becomes, the more likely fragments endure. Modern technology offers both paths. Centralized systems dominate efficiency. Distributed systems support resilience. The choice between them is ongoing. Energy grids, information networks, food production, governance. Every decision nudges civilization toward fragility or flexibility. And unlike earlier societies, we can see the trade-offs in advance. We can simulate collapse scenarios, model feedback, loops, predict tipping points. But prediction alone does not prevent repetition. Only behaviour change does, which raises a critical question. Is humanity capable of learning from a past it does not officially acknowledge? Because breaking the cycle requires accepting that the cycle exists. And that acceptance threatens narratives of exceptionalism. If we are not unique, then responsibility increases. If others failed before us, then success is not guaranteed. This awareness can inspire humility or denial. Denial is easier. Humility demands change. Throughout history, humility has rarely emerged voluntarily. It often arrives through loss, but loss is not inevitable. Some societies adapted successfully to change. They downsized, relocated, altered practices. They did not avoid disruption, but they survived it. These societies rarely built empires. They left fewer monuments, but their descendants remain. Perhaps the goal is not to prevent collapse, but to prevent erasure. Earlier, civilizations were erased because their knowledge was not portable. Cities sank, libraries burned, technologies depended on centralized infrastructure. We can design differently. Knowledge can be decentralized. Skills can be widespread. Systems can fail gracefully. This is not regression, it is evolution. The concept of anti-fragility captures this idea. Systems that improve through stress rather than break. Nature operates this way. Civilizations rarely do, but they could. This requires redefining success, not as maximum output, but as sustainable continuity, not as growth, but as a balance, not as domination, but as integration. These shifts are already visible in small ways. Regenerative agriculture, circular economies, open source knowledge. They are often dismissed as idealistic, but earlier civilizations that ignored ecological feedback were not idealistic. They were confident, and confidence proved fatal. If the seventh civilization is to avoid the fate of the sixth, before it must cultivate a different relationship with uncertainty. Not fear, respect for limits, respect for cycles, respect for complexity. This does not mean abandoning technology. It means aligning technology with resilience, using power to stabilize rather than accelerate, using knowledge to adapt rather than dominate. If we succeed, history may record something unprecedented, not the absence of collapse, but the mitigation of erasure. A civilization that transforms rather than disappears, one that passes knowledge intentionally rather than accidentally, one that understands that survival is not about permanence, but continuity. This may be the quiet task of our era, not to conquer the future, but to steward it. In the final segment, we will step back from speculation and examine what this understanding ultimately means for identity, responsibility, and the story humanity tells about itself. If the idea of repeating civilizations is correct, even partially, then it changes something fundamental about how humanity understands itself, not politically, not technologically, but psychologically. For thousands of years, humans have told a single story about their origin, a story of ascent, of ignorance giving way to knowledge, of chaos refined into order, of progress marching forward, never backward. it is a comforting story. It suggests inevitability. It suggests safety. It suggests that tomorrow will always be more advanced than yesterday. But cyclical history offers a very different narrative, one in which progress is temporary, knowledge is fragile, and advancement is not a guarantee, only a phase. This realization is unsettling, not because it predicts collapse, but because it removes the illusion of immunity. If civilizations can rise and fall repeatedly, then no amount of intelligence exempts a society from consequence. The past stops being a ladder. It becomes a mirror. When earlier cultures spoke of golden ages, followed by destruction, modern scholars often interpreted those stories as moral allegory, hubris punished by gods, order restored through catastrophe. But allegory is rarely invented from nothing. It is often a symbolic compression of lived experience. If humanity has endured multiple global disruptions, then the emotional residue of those events would not vanish. It would imprint itself on collective psychology. And in subtle ways it has. Humans display a strange duality. We build as though permanence is possible, but we prepare for loss instinctively. We archive, we encode, we pass stories to children. Even our fascination with apocalypse reflects this tension. From ancient flood myths to modern disaster films, humanity repeatedly rehearses the end, not as entertainment alone, but as preparation. We imagine what survives, what matters, what is worth carrying forward. This instinct makes sense in a cyclical framework. If collapse has happened before, then cultural memory may not remember details, but it remembers the pattern. Fear of forgetting, fear of erasure, fear of being the last. These anxieties are not new. They appear in ancient texts as laments for lost knowledge, warnings against arrogance, and instructions to preserve wisdom for future generations. What changes now is that we can contextualize those warnings scientifically. We can see that civilizations collapsed not because people were foolish, but because systems became too complex, too rigid, too detached from environmental reality. Earlier societies lacked the ability to see the full scope of the cycle. We do not. This awareness carries responsibility. It means that ignorance is no longer an excuse. If we continue repeating behaviours known to destabilise civilizations, then collapse becomes not a tragedy, but a choice. This reframes modern debates entirely. Climate change is not a political issue. It is a cyclical pressure. Resource depletion is not an economic problem. It is a systemic stressor. Biodiversity loss is not an environmental inconvenience. It is a resilience deficit. These are not isolated challenges. They are symptoms of the same pattern. And patterns do not respond to denial. They respond to adjustment. If humanity is the seventh civilization, then it occupies a unique position. It is the first to have evidence of those that came before, the first to detect global change in real time, the first to archive knowledge digitally across the planet. But this advantage cuts both ways. Digital knowledge is powerful, but fragile. Data requires energy. Energy requires infrastructure. Infrastructure requires stability. Without foresight, even the most advanced archives vanish faster than stone. Earlier civilizations carved their knowledge into rock, clay, and monument because those materials endured collapse. We carve ours into electricity. This creates urgency. If knowledge is to survive disruption, it must be portable, redundant, and understandable without advanced systems. Some researchers argue that humanity should deliberately create knowledge arks, physical repositories designed to withstand climate shifts, power loss, and social upheaval. Others advocate for embedding knowledge into culture rather than storage. Skills passed through practice survive longer than information stored externally. A society that can rebuild agriculture, medicine, navigation, and governance from memory is more resilient than one dependent on servers. This is not regression. It is continuity planning. Earlier, civilizations failed to pass on operational knowledge effectively. They left monuments, but not manuals, stories, but not instructions. The survivors of each collapse carried fragments. But fragments are not enough to prevent repetition. If the cycle is to be broken, or at least softened, then humanity must do what no prior civilization appears to have done: intentionally prepare its successors. This requires humility. It means accepting that we may not be the final chapter, that our role may be to preserve conditions for something that comes after us. This challenges the modern obsession with legacy. Most civilizations sought immortality through dominance. Perhaps true endurance comes through stewardship. There is another psychological shift that cyclical history introduces. It reframes the concept of primitive. If earlier civilizations were erased, then simplicity does not equal inferiority. Hunter-gatherer societies may not represent humanity's infancy, but its recovery phase. After collapse, simplicity is survival. Complexity returns gradually. This perspective casts ancient peoples in a new light. They were not ignorant. They were adaptive. They rebuilt with what remained. Myths become survival literature. Rituals become mnemonic devices. Architecture becomes a way of encoding knowledge into landscape. When modern people dismiss ancient stories as superstition, they may be dismissing compressed survival knowledge passed through generations. This does not mean every myth is literal. It means every myth deserves attention, because patterns survive when facts do not. Another implication of cyclical history concerns identity. Modern humans often define themselves as the pinnacle of evolution. But evolution does not have pinnacles, it has adaptations, and adaptations are context dependent. A trait beneficial in one environment becomes a liability in another. Earlier civilizations may have optimized for stability. Until stability vanished, we may be optimizing for efficiency until efficiency becomes fragility. Recognizing this does not diminish humanity, it humanizes it. We are not gods mastering nature, we are organisms embedded within it. This realization shifts ethics as well. If collapse is possible, then inequality becomes dangerous. Highly unequal societies concentrate vulnerability. When systems fail, those without resources suffer disproportionately. Earlier collapses often amplified social divides. Elites protected themselves, briefly. But collapse does not respect hierarchy. It dissolves it. Resilient societies distribute capacity broadly. Education, skills, access to resources, not as charity, but as survival strategy. The archaeological record supports this. Societies with extreme stratification tend to collapse more violently. Those with more egalitarian structures endure longer or fragment less catastrophically. This suggests that social organisation matters as much as technology. Another overlooked implication concerns time. Modern culture prioritises speed, faster production, faster communication, faster growth. But speed amplifies mistakes. Earlier civilizations moved slower, not by choice, but by limitation. Slowness allowed feedback. Modern acceleration suppresses it. By the time consequences appear, systems are already committed. Breaking the cycle may require deliberate deceleration, not everywhere, but in critical domains: energy transition, urban development, resource extraction. Slowing down allows adjustment. Ignoring limits invites correction, often violently. Nature enforces balance eventually. The question is whether correction arrives as adaptation or collapse. This brings us to a final, deeply personal implication. If civilizations rise and fall, then meaning cannot depend on permanence. Legacy cannot depend on monuments. Identity cannot depend on dominance. Meaning must exist at smaller scales, in relationships, in knowledge passed forward, in care for those who come next. Earlier civilizations may have failed not because they lacked brilliance, but because they misidentified what mattered. They built outward faster than inward. They expanded territory before understanding restraint. They mastered tools before mastering themselves. We have inherited their achievements and their risks, but we also inherit their lessons, if we choose to read them. The I cycle does not demand despair. It demands maturity. It invites humanity to stop seeing itself as exceptional and start seeing itself as responsible. Responsible not just for survival, but for continuity, for ensuring that if the world changes suddenly, something remains. Not just ruins, but wisdom. In the final segment, we will bring this exploration to a close, not by predicting catastrophe, but by narrowing the focus to the one question that matters most. What would it mean for us to live as though the cycle is real? Every civilization believes its knowledge will survive it. That belief is one of the most dangerous illusions a society can hold. When we imagine the collapse of an advanced culture, we often picture ruins left standing, libraries waiting to be rediscovered, instructions carved into stone, warnings preserved for those who come after. We imagine continuity through preservation, but history, when examined closely, tells a very different story. Knowledge does not disappear all at once. It narrows, it compresses, it bottlenecks, and then it breaks. This is the part of the cycle that almost never survives in memory, not because it is insignificant, but because it is invisible in hindsight. By the time archaeologists encounter the aftermath, the process has already completed itself. Civilizations do not lose knowledge because it is destroyed. They lose it because too few people carry it. At the height of every complex society, knowledge becomes specialized. Priests memorize calendars. Engineers understand structures. Astronomers track the heavens. Administrators maintain records. Artisans master techniques passed only through apprenticeship. This specialization creates efficiency, but it also creates fragility. When disruption arrives, whether through flood, fire, famine, or sudden climate shift, the first systems to fail are not monuments or cities, but networks. Trade routes collapse, communication fragments, institutions dissolve, and when that happens, specialists are suddenly isolated. An astronomer without instruments is just a person who remembers patterns. An engineer without tools is just someone with ideas. A priest without a temple becomes a storyteller. As populations scatter in survival mode, knowledge begins to shed layers. Precision vanishes first, context follows. Eventually, only fragments remain, rituals without explanation, symbols without meaning, stories without technical detail. This is the knowledge bottleneck. It is not intentional, it is structural. Earlier civilizations likely believed they were preserving wisdom by centralizing it. Temples, libraries, archives, priesthoods, schools reserved for elites. But centralization concentrates risk. When a centralized system fails, everything stored within it fails at once. Distributed knowledge survives disruption. Centralized knowledge does not. This pattern appears repeatedly across history. In Mesopotamia, writing emerges as an administrative tool controlled by a small class of scribes. When cities fall, literacy collapses with them. Entire writing systems disappear for centuries. In Egypt, astronomical and engineering knowledge is tied to priestly lineages. When political authority fractures, technical continuity fractures with it. Later builders imitate forms without understanding function. In the Roman world, concrete technology capable of enduring millennia vanishes within a few generations, not because the material was lost, but because the process was no longer transmitted. Knowledge did not fail because it was wrong. It failed because it was rare. Now imagine this problem scaled across a global catastrophe. Earlier in this investigation, we explored the possibility that previous civilizations were erased by abrupt environmental shifts, floods that rewrote coastlines, volcanic winters that darkened the sky, sudden freezes or heat spikes that collapsed food systems. In such conditions, survival overrides education. Parents teach children how to find water, not how to align monuments with stars. Communities prioritize shelter, not metallurgy. Language simplifies. Stories shorten. The most complex ideas, the ones requiring sustained explanation, are the first to be lost. What survives is not knowledge, but memory. Memory wrapped in myth. This explains something that has long puzzled researchers. Why do so many ancient myths contain hints of advanced understanding, astronomy, engineering, natural cycles, but lack practical instruction? Why do gods teach agriculture, but not irrigation mathematics? Why do culture heroes introduce calendars, but not the equations behind them? Because myth is what remains after explanation collapses. It is knowledge compressed into narrative. A calendar becomes a story about the sun god's journey. Engineering principles become tales of giants stacking stones. Astronomical observations become battles between celestial beings. These stories are not childish. They are adaptive. They are how information survives when literacy disappears. The knowledge bottleneck turns civilizations into myths, and myths, in turn, mislead later generations into believing that earlier cultures were primitive, symbolic, or irrational, when in reality they may be remembering something far more concrete. This reframes the question of suppression. Earlier we asked why evidence of ancient advancement might disappear, but perhaps much of it never had a chance to survive. Stone endures, metal corrodes, paper burns, digital memory vanishes instantly, but stories persist. They persist because they travel with people, and people travel when civilizations fall. This means that if 6 civilizations existed before ours, their most important legacy would not be artifacts. It would be patterns of belief, warnings embedded in ritual, cautionary tales repeated until their original meaning faded. Consider how many ancient cultures emphasize balance, balance between sky and earth, between humanity and nature, between order and chaos. These themes appear everywhere, often treated as moral or spiritual abstractions. But what if they began as practical lessons? What if imbalance, ecological, social, technological, was observed to precede collapse? Over time, that observation becomes mythologized. The warning remains. The mechanism is forgotten. This also explains why so many ancient societies are obsessed with cycles, not progress, cycles. Ages rise and fall. Worlds are destroyed and reborn. Civilizations restart. This worldview is often dismissed as fatalistic or naive, but from the perspective of survivors, it is empirical. If you live through collapse, history does not feel linear, it feels circular. You see structures rise, you see them fail, you see memory reset. The cycle becomes truth. Now consider the psychological impact of surviving such an event. Survivors would not frame themselves as the end of a civilization. They would frame themselves as the beginning of a new one. This is not arrogance, it is necessity. To survive, humans must believe the future is possible. So each post-collapse society tells itself a story of origin, a new beginning, a fresh dawn. This story is comforting. It allows people to build without grief, but it also severs continuity. The knowledge bottleneck ensures that even if fragments survive, they are no longer connected to their source. This may explain why advanced architecture appears suddenly in the archaeological record, not because it was invented overnight, but because it was remembered imperfectly. The builders are not innovators, they are imitators. They reconstruct what they have seen or heard described. They copy forms without grasping original purpose. Over generations, imitation becomes tradition. Tradition becomes culture. Culture becomes history. And history forgets what came before. This bottleneck also explains why earlier civilizations leave behind structures that seem over-engineered, why stones weigh far more than necessary, why precision exceeds functional need. These may not be optimizations, they may be echoes, attempts to replicate techniques once understood but no longer mastered. If knowledge was once widespread and later narrowed, then every new civilization is, in a sense, working from incomplete blueprints. This pattern repeats because the bottleneck repeats, and it raises an unsettling possibility. What if our civilization is creating its own bottleneck right now? Modern knowledge is vast, but it is also deeply specialized. How many people understand how power grids truly function? How many can repair satellite networks? How many know how to produce medicine without global supply chains? Our systems appear robust, but they are interdependent. When one fails, others cascade. This is the same vulnerability earlier civilizations faced, just at a higher level of complexity. If disruption occurs, much of our knowledge could bottleneck rapidly. Digital. Records vanish without power. Cloud storage disappears without infrastructure. AI systems fail without maintenance. The illusion of permanence is strong, but it is still an illusion. This realization connects directly to the idea of cycles. Civilizations do not fall because they lack intelligence. They fall because intelligence becomes trapped in systems too fragile to survive change. The bottleneck is not ignorance. It is overconfidence. Earlier civilizations likely believed their systems would endure. They did not plan for knowledge to be portable. They did not design continuity. They assumed stability. We are making similar assumptions. And this brings us to a critical transition in the story. If civilizations repeatedly lose knowledge through bottlenecks, then the real inheritance of humanity is not technology, it is memory. Memory imperfectly transmitted, memory distorted, memory encoded in stories, rituals, instincts, and perhaps even biology. This means the myths we inherited are not lies, they are survivors. And if that is true, then understanding ancient civilizations is not about uncovering artifacts alone. It is about decoding memory. In the next segment, we will explore what happens after the bottleneck closes, what it feels like to build a world on top of ruins you no longer recognize, why civilizations consistently mistake aftermath for origin, and how the illusion of a first civilization emerges after every collapse. Because before we can understand where we are going, we must understand why every civilization believes it is the beginning, when it is not. Every civilization tells itself the same story, that it is the first, that before it there was only silence, chaos, or simplicity. That history begins here. This belief is not propaganda in the modern sense, it is psychological necessity. When survivors gather after collapse, surrounded by unfamiliar landscapes and stripped of continuity, they need an origin story that makes sense of the void behind them. The easiest explanation is that there was nothing before, and so, again and again, the false dawn is born. The false dawn is the moment when a new civilization mistakes recovery for invention. It looks at the fragments left behind, half-understood techniques, inherited rituals, vague memories of prior order, and assumes they are discoveries rather than remnants. This illusion is powerful. It reshapes timelines. It rewrites identity. It becomes the foundation of culture. Archaeology, as a discipline, unintentionally reinforces this illusion. When evidence appears suddenly in the record, cities, writing, agriculture, it is labelled a revolution, a breakthrough, a miraculous leap forward. But revolutions rarely occur without preparation. What looks like sudden invention may actually be sudden recovery. Consider the agricultural transition. Textbooks describe a shift from hunting and gathering to farming around 12,000 years ago. This shift appears abrupt, almost miraculous. Within a few centuries, humans domesticate plants, build permanent settlements, and reorganize society. But domestication is not simple. It requires generations of observation, experimentation, selective breeding, and environmental manipulation. It is not something discovered accidentally and perfected immediately. So why does it appear fully formed? One explanation is inheritance. Survivors of an earlier civilization may have retained partial agricultural knowledge, what plants grow best, how seasons shift, how soil responds. They may not have remembered the science, but they remembered the practice. Practice survives better than theory. When theory is lost, practice becomes tradition. Tradition becomes discovery. The false dawn erases the memory of what came before, even as it builds upon it. The same pattern appears with writing, cuneiform, hieroglyphs. Early scripts emerge with surprising complexity. Symbol systems appear already standardized, capable of expressing abstract ideas, numbers, and administration. This is not how writing normally evolves. One would expect centuries of crude marks, gradual refinement, regional variation. Instead, we see coherence. This suggests not invention, but reconstruction. Fragments of symbolic systems carried forward, simplified, adapted, and reassembled into something new. The survivors did not create writing from nothing. They remembered that writing existed. They rebuilt it. The false dawn convinces later generations that this rebuilding is the beginning. Architecture follows the same pattern. Early monumental structures are often the most precise. Later ones decline in quality. This inversion confounds linear models of progress. Technology should improve over time. Instead, we see regression. The earliest stonework is often the finest. The largest blocks are fitted with the greatest accuracy. Later additions are smaller, rougher, less precise. This suggests that early builders were not pioneering techniques. They were copying something already perfected. The false dawn transforms imitation into origin. It explains away inconsistencies by redefining the timeline. This illusion becomes institutionalized. Calendars reset. Kings declare themselves founders. Myths describe creation. Entire cultures align their identity around being first. Once written down, these stories become self-reinforcing. Future generations inherit them as fact. Even when anomalies appear, they are forced to fit the narrative. Out-of-place artifacts are dismissed. Older layers are redated. Structures are attributed to later cultures despite lacking evidence. The false dawn protects the illusion, but it also blinds civilization to its own vulnerability. If you believe you are the first, then you believe collapse is impossible, or at least unprecedented. You have no template for failure. Earlier civilizations may have known collapse was possible, but that knowledge was lost in the bottleneck. Each new civilization inherits the amnesia. This creates a tragic rhythm: rise, forget, repeat. The false dawn also shapes moral frameworks. Early societies often portray themselves as chosen, favoured by gods, destined for greatness. These beliefs reinforce cohesion, but they also justify expansion, exploitation, and rigidity. If collapse comes, it is interpreted as punishment, not pattern. This interpretation shifts responsibility away from systemic behaviour. It turns feedback into judgment. Judgment cannot be engineered around. Patterns can. The false dawn also influences how knowledge is organised. New civilizations categorize earlier remnants as primitive. They reinterpret advanced artifacts as ceremonial or symbolic. They underestimate the capabilities of those who came before. This creates a hierarchy of time. Past equals inferior, present equals superior, future equals destiny. But the archaeological record resists this hierarchy. Precision appears early. Complexity appears suddenly and then disappears. This is not progress, it is oscillation. The false dawn blinds us to oscillation by flattening history into a line. The cost of this blindness is repetition. When similar stresses arise, climate shifts, resource depletion, population pressure, civilizations respond as if for the first time. They experiment blindly. They centralize authority. They prioritize control over adaptation. They repeat the same mistakes with new tools. Our era exhibits the same tendencies. We frame modern challenges as unprecedented. Climate change, globalization, technological acceleration. But none of these are unprecedented in effect, only in scale. Earlier civilizations faced rapid climate shifts. They faced globalization within their known world. They experienced technological acceleration relative to their baseline. The difference is not novelty, it is memory. We remember more, but do we understand more? The false dawn encourages optimism without humility. It tells us that because we survived until now, we will continue to survive. But survival in one cycle does not guarantee survival in the next. Earlier civilizations survived their beginnings too. They built, they flourished, they believed, and then they vanished. This is not pessimism, it is pattern recognition. If we are to avoid repeating the cycle, we must first dismantle the false dawn. We must accept that we are not unique, that we are inheritors, not originators, that our technologies may be echoes, not breakthroughs. This acceptance is uncomfortable. It challenges narratives of progress. It destabilizes identity, but it also unlocks perspective. If we see ourselves as part of a long sequence, then the goal changes. We are not racing toward a peak. We are navigating a curve. The task is not to reach the highest point. It is to avoid the steepest fall. This requires humility. Humility allows learning. Learning allows adaptation. Adaptation allows continuity. The false dawn must give way to a different story. One that sees history not as a staircase, but as a wave, rising, falling, returning. We are somewhere on that wave. Where exactly remains uncertain. But what is clear is this. If we continue to believe we are the first, we will behave like all the others did. And if we behave the same way, the outcome will be the same. In the next segment, we will examine the cost of survival itself, what it means to carry fragments of a collapsed world forward, how trauma shapes culture, and why the survivors of previous cycles may have unintentionally passed down fear along with wisdom. Because survival is not just physical, it is psychological, and what we inherit emotionally may shape our fate as much as what we inherit materially. Survival leaves marks that do not fade with time. When a civilization collapses, the survivors carry more than memories of what was lost. They carry fear, caution, and an altered understanding of the world. These psychological imprints shape the cultures that rise afterward, often in ways the survivors themselves do not consciously recognize. This is the survivor's burden. It is not merely the challenge of rebuilding. It is the weight of remembering that the world can end. Earlier, we explored how knowledge bottlenecks compress complex understanding into myth. But alongside that compression occurs another transformation. Trauma becomes tradition. When people live through sudden catastrophe, flood, fire, famine, darkness, They do not simply forget it. They encode it into behaviour, into ritual, into law, into belief. This is how fear becomes sacred. Across ancient cultures, we see striking similarities in moral codes that emphasise order above all else. Laws that punish deviation harshly, rituals that must be performed precisely, calendars that warn of dangerous times when the gods are restless, stories that frame chaos as an enemy that must be held at bay. These patterns are often interpreted as primitive attempts to control nature or impose social cohesion, but viewed through the lens of survival psychology, they take on a different meaning. They are defensive adaptations. Survivors of collapse do not trust stability, they know how quickly it can vanish. So they build cultures that prioritise predictability, repetition, and control. Ritual becomes a way to reassure the community that the world is still ordered. Myth becomes a way to explain trauma without reliving it. Authority becomes a way to prevent fragmentation. This is not irrational, it is protective. But protection has a cost. Cultures shaped by trauma tend to resist change. They cling to tradition. They fear innovation. They interpret disruption as danger rather than opportunity. Over time, this rigidity becomes another vulnerability. The irony is painful. The same instincts that help survivors rebuild can eventually limit a civilization's ability to adapt to new challenges. This pattern appears repeatedly. After floods, societies emphasize water rituals and taboos. After famines, cultures centralize food control. After social collapse, law codes become severe. These responses are understandable, but when they persist beyond their original context, they create systems optimized for past threats, not future ones. This may explain why so many ancient cultures worship gods who are both teachers and destroyers. These deities bring knowledge, agriculture, writing, law, but also threaten annihilation if order is broken. The gods are not merely moral enforcers. They are embodiments of memory. They represent forces that once ended the world. To disobey them is to risk repeating that end. This framework allows trauma to be transmitted across generations without explicit explanation. Children are not told, "Our world collapsed once." They are told, "The gods punish disorder." The lesson survives. The reason fades. Over centuries, this produces civilizations that are deeply cautious. Innovations are introduced slowly. Authority is revered. Tradition is sanctified. But when environmental or social conditions shift beyond what tradition can manage, these civilizations struggle. They have optimized for stability in a world that demands flexibility. The survivor's burden also shapes how cultures remember the past. Trauma compresses memory, events blur, causes are simplified, responsibility is externalized, catastrophe becomes divine will, fate, or cosmic cycle. This relieves psychological stress. It also prevents analysis. If collapse is framed as inevitable or ordained, there is no incentive to study its mechanisms, no incentive to change behaviour. This framing may have allowed survivors to function emotionally, but it prevented future generations from learning how to avoid repetition. This is not a moral failure, it is a human one. Trauma narrows focus to survival. Reflection comes later, if at all. And yet, even within trauma-shaped cultures, we find anomalies, stories that question authority, myths that hint at lost knowledge, rituals whose purpose seems practical rather than symbolic. These are traces of resistance to forgetting, perhaps carried by individuals who understood more than they could safely share, perhaps preserved by marginalised groups less invested in official narratives, perhaps encoded deliberately, knowing that overt warnings would be ignored or suppressed. This brings us to the idea of cultural layering. After a collapse, new civilizations are not built on blank ground. They are built atop emotional ruins as well as physical ones. Fear sits beneath confidence, memory beneath myth, warning beneath celebration. This layering creates contradictions. Civilizations celebrate progress while fearing change. They revere innovation but punish deviation. They build monuments to permanence while telling stories of destruction. These contradictions are not accidental. They are symptoms of a species that remembers catastrophe but cannot fully articulate it. The survivor's burden may also explain why earlier civilizations appear obsessed with celestial observation. Tracking the sky becomes a way to predict danger, comets, eclipses, planetary alignments. These are framed as omens, but they may have once been early warning systems. If a prior collapse involved cosmic events, impacts, radiation bursts, solar disruptions, then watching the sky would be a rational response. Over time, observation becomes ritual. Ritual becomes worship. Worship becomes dogma. The original purpose fades, but the vigilance remains. This vigilance appears in architecture aligned to stars, in calendars tracking long cycles, in myths warning of fire from the sky. These are not superstitions. They are memories distorted by time. The survivor's burden also shapes migration patterns. After collapse, people disperse. They seek safety in diversity, mountains, islands, forests, places less likely to be uniformly affected by catastrophe. This dispersal spreads fragments of culture widely, but it also isolates them. Isolation accelerates divergence. Languages split, rituals mutate, stories adapt to new environments. Within a few generations, shared origins are no longer recognizable. This makes reconstruction difficult. When archaeologists encounter similar myths across continents, they often attribute them to coincidence or archetypes, but archetypes themselves may be the residue of shared trauma. If humanity has experienced multiple global disruptions, it would develop recurring psychological patterns: fear of flood, fear of fire, fear of darkness, fear of sudden change. These fears shape art, religion, and social structure. They also influence how civilizations respond to new threats, often by denial, because acknowledging vulnerability reactivates trauma. Modern society is not immune to this. We frame climate instability as abstract data. We debate timelines. We argue over responsibility. We delay action. This is not ignorance. It is avoidance. Avoidance is a common trauma response. If the survivor's burden has been carried forward biologically and culturally, then our resistance to confronting collapse may not be purely political or economic. It may be psychological. We may be reenacting the same coping strategies, delay, ritualization, externalization, that earlier civilizations used, and those strategies did not save them. This does not mean we are doomed to repeat their fate, but it does mean we must recognize the burden we carry. We are not blank slates. We are descendants of the survivors. Our fears, myths, and institutions may be shaped by events we no longer consciously remember. Understanding this gives us an advantage. It allows us to separate warning from superstition, to distinguish memory from myth, to honour trauma without being ruled by it. If we can do this, then the survivor's burden can become a survivor's guide, a source of wisdom rather than fear. But this requires confronting uncomfortable questions. What are we afraid to examine? What patterns do we dismiss because they challenge our sense of control? What warnings are embedded in our stories that we no longer understand? In the next segment, we will explore why cycles appear to accelerate over time, why collapses seem to occur closer together, and why each new civilization feels more intense and more fragile than the last. Because if the rhythm of history is speeding up, then understanding it becomes not just an academic exercise, but a practical Necessity. There is a quiet detail hidden in the long arc of history that rarely receives attention. Each collapse appears to arrive faster than the last. The interval between rises shortens. The peaks grow steeper. The falls become more abrupt. This is not intuition, it is observable. Geological records show that early environmental cycles unfolded over tens of thousands of years. Ice ages advanced slowly, sea levels crept upward across millennia. Ecosystems adapted gradually. Civilizations, if they existed, had time to respond, relocate and reconfigure. But as time moves forward, the tempo increases. Climate shifts compress into centuries, then decades, then years. The rhythm tightens. This acceleration is not arbitrary. It emerges from the interaction between planetary systems and human systems, each amplifying the other. Earth operates on cycles, but civilizations intensify their impact on those cycles. Every technological leap increases humanity's capacity to alter environments, sometimes intentionally, often unknowingly. Each cycle of civilization leaves behind changes that accumulate rather than reset completely. Earlier, collapses rewrote landscapes. Later collapses inherit those alterations. The planet remembers. Deforestation accelerates erosion. Erosion alters river systems. Altered rivers affect climate feedback loops. Once these feedback loops begin, they do not wait for permission. Earlier civilizations may have triggered changes without understanding them. Modern civilization understands far more, but influences far more as well. This creates a paradox. Greater knowledge does not guarantee stability. It can increase risk. Acceleration also emerges from population density. Earlier civilizations, even advanced ones, supported millions at most. Modern civilization supports billions. Dense populations require tightly coupled systems: food, energy, transportation, medicine. These systems are efficient. They are also brittle. A localized failure in a sparse world remains local. In a dense world, it cascades. One drought becomes a global food shortage. One disrupted shipping route affects multiple continents. One regional conflict destabilizes entire markets. This coupling accelerates collapse dynamics. There is less slack, less margin for error, less time to respond. Acceleration is also psychological. Information spreads faster than understanding. Fear travels instantly. Rumours outpace analysis. Confidence collapses before systems do. Earlier civilizations experienced panic locally. We experience it globally, simultaneously. This matters because collapse is not only physical, it is social. Trust erodes before infrastructure fails. Markets crash before resources disappear. Institutions weaken before alternatives exist. Acceleration magnifies these effects. The faster information flows, the faster confidence can dissolve. This does not mean modern civilization is uniquely fragile. It means it is uniquely fast. Speed compresses decision-making. Compressed decisions favour short-term solutions. Short-term solutions exacerbate long-term instability. This feedback loop appears repeatedly in earlier cycles. Civilizations near collapse often intensify exploitation. They extract more resources. They expand faster. They centralize power. They accelerate the very processes undermining them. Acceleration feels like control. In reality, it is loss of balance. Another contributor to cycle acceleration lies in technological inheritance. Each civilization inherits the remnants of previous ones, not as functional systems, but as altered environments. Soil depleted by ancient agriculture, coastlines reshaped by prior floods, atmospheric composition altered by past eruptions. These inherited conditions shorten recovery time. The baseline shifts. Each new civilization begins closer to instability. This may explain why the apparent lifespan of civilizations shortens over time. not because humanity is failing more quickly, but because it is starting from a more fragile foundation. The deeper we dig into geological layers, the clearer this becomes. Abrupt transitions increase in frequency. Event layers cluster closer together. The Earth is not calming, it is responding. Human activity accelerates that response. This does not mean collapse is imminent. It means the window for correction narrows. Earlier civilizations had centuries to adapt. We may have decades. This compression explains the urgency embedded in many ancient myths, warnings of sudden endings, tales of skies falling without warning, stories of days that felt like years. These were not exaggerations, they were descriptions of acceleration. When systems cross thresholds, change no longer proceeds linearly, it cascades. The survivor's burden becomes heavier, trauma accumulates faster, recovery becomes harder. This acceleration also explains why earlier collapses appear cleaner in the archaeological record. Long intervals allow sediment to settle. Short intervals create messy overlaps. Our era may leave behind a chaotic layer, plastic, metal, chemical residues, difficult to interpret. Future archaeologists may struggle to reconstruct our timeline. They may see confusion rather than clarity. Acceleration complicates memory. This raises an important implication. If cycles are accelerating, then breaking the pattern becomes more urgent. Delay increases risk. Incremental. Reform may not be enough. Adaptation must outpace acceleration. That is a formidable challenge, but it is not impossible. Acceleration works both ways. Just as collapse dynamics speed up, so can adaptation, if directed deliberately. Information spreads quickly. Coordination is possible at global scale. Knowledge sharing is unprecedented. These capabilities could mitigate collapse if used to increase resilience rather than extraction. This returns us to a central tension. Modern civilization possesses tools that could either amplify collapse or soften it. The outcome depends on alignment between knowledge and behaviour, between awareness and action, between speed and restraint. If we continue to accelerate without adjusting direction, the cycle will complete itself. If we redirect acceleration toward resilience, the cycle may bend. This is not optimism. It is conditional possibility. Earlier civilizations lacked the ability to observe cycles beyond their own experience. We do not. We can see patterns across deep time. We can recognize warning signs. We can model outcomes. The question is whether we will act on that knowledge. Acceleration reduces the margin for error, but it also clarifies choices. The path forward narrows but becomes visible. In the next segment, we will explore the moment where civilizations face a fork, the point where continuation and erasure diverge, not as abstract theory, but as practical decision. Because if cycles can accelerate, they can also be altered, and whether we choose alteration or repetition may define what survives of us when this cycle ends. Every civilization reaches a moment it does not recognize as decisive. It is not announced. There is no clear dividing line, no singular event that declares, this is the turning point. Instead, there is a quiet convergence of pressures, a narrowing of options, until the future begins to lean in one direction more than another. This is the fork in the timeline. For earlier civilizations, this moment passed unnoticed. They experienced it as a series of unrelated challenges. A drought here, a political conflict there, a technological breakthrough that promised relief, a new system meant to stabilize what was already unstable. By the time the pattern became visible, choice had collapsed into reaction. What makes our moment different is not that the fork exists, it always has. What makes it different is that we can see it forming. The evidence is not dramatic, It does not arrive as prophecy or catastrophe. It arrives as accumulation, rising baseline temperatures, shrinking biodiversity, increasing dependence on systems that require constant maintenance, a global population synchronized to supply chains with little redundancy. Individually, none of these guarantee collapse. Collectively, they define a narrowing corridor. The fork does not separate survival from extinction. It separates continuity from erasure. Earlier civilizations often survived biologically, but were erased culturally. Their cities sank, their languages vanished, their knowledge fragmented into myth. The people lived on, but the civilization did not. This distinction matters. Civilization is not the same as species. The fork asks, what do we want to preserve? If the goal is mere survival, humanity is resilient. If the goal is continuity of knowledge, identity and wisdom, the challenge is far greater. At this fork, civilizations face two paths. One path prioritizes control, centralization, efficiency, extraction. It promises stability through dominance. This path often feels rational, especially under pressure. It concentrates decision-making. It simplifies coordination. It accelerates response. But it also increases fragility. Centralized systems fail catastrophically. When they break everywhere. The other path prioritizes resilience, distribution, redundancy, adaptability. It feels slower, less efficient, less impressive, but it bends rather than shatters. This path rarely produces monuments. It produces continuity. Earlier civilizations overwhelmingly chose the first path, not because they were foolish, but because the second path requires sacrificing short-term advantage for long-term stability. It requires restraint. Restraint is difficult when competition exists. If one society slows, another accelerates. The accelerating society gains power, temporarily. History shows that this advantage is often short-lived, but in the moment it feels decisive. This dynamic traps civilizations in escalation. Each innovation demands another. Each expansion requires further extraction. The system grows too large to slow without pain. Eventually, it cannot slow at all. The fork closes. Our civilization is approaching this same dynamic. Technological acceleration offers solutions to problems caused by previous acceleration. Energy transitions address emissions. Engineering attempts to stabilize climate feedback. Artificial intelligence manages complexity created by human systems. These solutions may work, or they may compound dependency. The difference lies in intent. Are we using technology to reduce vulnerability or to maintain unsustainable growth? This question is rarely asked openly. Economic incentives favour growth. Political systems reward short-term success. Cultural narratives celebrate expansion. The fork is not only technical, it is philosophical. What do we believe civilization is for? Earlier, civilizations often believed it existed to dominate nature, to extract resources, to impose order. This worldview delivered short-term prosperity. It also delivered long-term instability. A resilient civilization views itself as part of a system, not above it. It recognizes that limits are not enemies, but guides. This does not require abandoning ambition. It requires redefining it. Ambition focused on durability rather than scale, on longevity rather than speed, on harmony rather than conquest. This shift may sound abstract, but it manifests in concrete choices. Energy systems that emphasize decentralization, agriculture that restores soil rather than depleting it, urban design that accommodates change rather than resisting it, education that teaches systems thinking rather than specialization alone. These are not utopian ideas, they are survival strategies. The fork also operates at the level of narrative. What stories do we tell about ourselves? Do we frame humanity as conqueror of nature or as participant within it? Earlier civilizations told stories of dominion. Those stories justified exploitation. They also normalized collapse. If gods controlled fate, human behavior mattered less. Modern narratives risk similar fatalism through technological determinism. The belief that innovation will save us regardless of behavior. This belief reduces accountability. It delays change. At the fork, narratives matter. They shape what societies prioritize. They influence what sacrifices are acceptable. They define what success looks like. Changing narrative does not change reality immediately, but it changes response. Earlier civilizations lacked the ability to coordinate narrative change at scale. We do not. Information moves quickly. Culture shifts rapidly. This is both risk and opportunity. Narratives can radicalize. They can also reorient. If the dominant story becomes one of resilience rather than domination, choices follow. The fork also involves memory. Do we acknowledge cyclical history, or do we cling to linear progress? Acknowledging cycles does not mean surrendering to inevitability. It means planning for disruption. Earlier civilizations that failed to plan for collapse left no instructions. They assumed permanence. We can choose otherwise. We can document not just how we lived, but how to rebuild, how to preserve knowledge in low-tech forms, how to pass skills across generations, how to maintain continuity without infrastructure. This is not pessimism. It is stewardship. The fork does not demand abandoning civilization. It demands redefining its purpose. Civilization as continuity rather than dominance, as adaptation rather than expansion, as memory rather than monument. If we choose this path, the eighth civilization, if it comes, may not begin in ignorance. It may inherit clarity. If we do not, history suggests what follows: collapse, fragmentation, mythologization, rediscovery, repeat. The fork is narrow, but it is visible. The question is not whether we are at it. The question is whether we will recognize it as such. In the final segment, we will step back from analysis and ask what it means to live consciously within a cycle. How identity changes when permanence is abandoned. What responsibility looks like when legacy is measured in resilience rather than dominance. And why accepting impermanence may be the most stabilizing choice a civilization can make. There is a subtle shift that happens when a civilization accepts that it is not permanent. At first, it feels destabilizing. The familiar anchors loosen. The promise of endless progress weakens. The idea of being the culmination of history quietly dissolves. But something else takes its place. Clarity. Earlier civilizations never truly saw themselves inside a cycle. They experienced time as myth, prophecy, or destiny. They sensed repetition, but they lacked the distance to recognize structure. They felt the rise and fall, but they could not step outside it. We can. That is the quiet difference of the seventh civilization. To live inside a cycle consciously is not to live in fear of collapse. It is to live with an altered sense of purpose. When permanence is no longer the goal, different values emerge. Longevity replaces dominance. Adaptability replaces control. Continuity replaces accumulation. This does not mean abandoning achievement. It means reframing it. Earlier civilizations measured success by what they built. Monuments, cities, empires. But monuments do not survive cycles intact. What survives are practices, ways of growing food, ways of sharing knowledge, ways of resolving conflict, ways of living with uncertainty. If earlier civilizations left behind instructions instead of empires, we might know far more about them today. Instead, we inherit stone and silence. Living inside the cycle means choosing to leave behind something different. Not proof of greatness, but tools for endurance. This perspective alters how we think about identity. Modern identity is deeply tied to achievement. Careers, nations, technologies, growth curves. These markers assume continuity. They assume that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to justify long-term accumulation. But cycles disrupt continuity. When disruption arrives, identity anchored to permanence fractures. Survivors are those whose identity is portable, those who define themselves by skills, relationships and understanding, rather than status or infrastructure. This does not require abandoning modern life. It requires diversification of meaning. A civilization that survives cycles does not place all of its identity in any single structure, political, economic, or technological. It distributes meaning. Earlier societies often failed here. When empires fell, identity collapsed with them. People were left disoriented, forced to rebuild without context. This may explain why myths after collapse often emphasize rebirth, renewal, and chosen beginnings. They provide identity when continuity is lost. We can do better. We can create identities that acknowledge impermanence without requiring catastrophe to reset meaning. This also changes how we view responsibility. Responsibility is often framed as stewardship of resources for future generations. But within a cyclical framework, responsibility expands. It becomes stewardship of knowledge across discontinuity. Not just preserving information, but ensuring it can be understood without context. Not just storing data, but teaching principles. Not just archiving techniques, but explaining why they matter. This is harder than preservation. It requires intentional simplification without loss of meaning. It requires redundancy without stagnation. It requires humility about what future generations will know and what they will not. Earlier civilizations underestimated how much context their successors would lose. We can learn from that mistake. If the next cycle brings disruption, survivors will not need our complexity. They will need our clarity. How to find clean water, how to grow food in altered climates, how to cooperate without centralized authority, how to recognize early warning signs. These are not primitive concerns. They are universal ones. Living inside the cycle also reshapes our relationship with fear. Fear often arises from the unknown. Cycles make the unknown partially known. We cannot predict specifics, but we can anticipate patterns. This reduces panic. It allows preparation without obsession. Earlier civilizations often responded to warning signs with denial or ritualization. We can respond with adaptation. This does not require abandoning hope. It reframes it. Hope becomes confidence in adaptability rather than faith in permanence. Confidence that humanity can reorganize itself. Confidence that knowledge can survive disruption. Confidence that continuity is possible even when forms change. This confidence is not naive. It is earned through understanding. Understanding that collapse is not failure. Erasure is. The difference lies in preparation. As the seventh civilization, we occupy a unique position. We stand on the ruins of many worlds. We can see the pattern. We can choose to honour it or ignore it. Ignoring it does not stop the cycle. It simply ensures repetition. Honouring it opens a narrow but meaningful path. A path where civilization becomes less brittle, where systems are designed to fail gracefully, where knowledge flows freely rather than being guarded, where resilience is valued more than scale. This path does not lead to utopia, it leads to continuity. And continuity may be the highest achievement possible within a cyclical world. As this journey draws to a close, it is worth returning to the quiet truth beneath everything we have explored. Civilizations rise and fall. This is not tragedy, it is rhythm. What matters is not avoiding the rhythm, but learning to move with it, to anticipate the turn, to pass knowledge forward intentionally, to accept impermanence without surrender. If we do this, then even if the cycle turns again, humanity will not begin from silence. It will begin from understanding. And perhaps, for the first time, that will be enough.